chapter 7, which is our second chapter on personnel selection. In chapter 6, we talked about the different types of selection procedures, and now we're going to talk about how to use these selection tools as well as possible issues that may arise with them. So remember, we talked about interviews and personality tests and intelligence tests and job samples and all those different ways of selecting people for a job. Now we're going to talk about all of the issues that happen with using them. We'll talk about legal issues and we'll talk about validity issues, and it's actually pretty interesting. I like this chapter. So once an organization chooses which predictors, which selection methods they're going to use, there's lots more decisions they need to make. Should they administer them all at once or in a certain order? Should some scores be worth more than other scores? All the while, they need to make sure that everything they're doing is legal and will be defensible in court. So there's 5 main issues. They're not really steps, but they're issues in the process of choosing your selection procedures and deploying your selection procedures as an organization. The first is recruitment. It's important to choose good recruitment strategies that will maximize the number of people as well as how qualified they are. The second issue is to make sure that all of your predictors, your selection methods, are valid. We're going to talk a lot about validity in this chapter. The third thing is to ensure that those predictors are legally defensible, which ties in a lot with the validity. Fourth is to address the strategies for actually administering these predictors and using their data. This is definitely the trickiest part. We'll spend some time on number 4. And finally, it's important to consider how applicants experience the hiring process. This is called applicant reactions, and we'll discuss this at the end of the chapter. So, as I mentioned, the first issue is recruitment. It's very important to choose a recruitment strategy that maximizes the number of people as well as how qualified they are. Let's read the definition for recruitment and then we'll talk about it a little. Recruitment is an organizational activity focused on increasing the number of job applicants, their quality and fit with the job openings and with the organization's culture, and at the same time, meeting the organization's legal and ethical obligations with regard to diversity. Let's unpack that for a minute. It's focused on increasing the number of applicants, but also increasing their quality and their fit with the job openings and with the organization's culture. It's also important that the recruitment meets all of the organization's legal and ethical obligations. We'll be talking a lot about those legal obligations with regard to diversity of who they recruit and who they hire and who they employ. Let's talk about recruitment methods. As I'm sure you know, many employers use career websites, social media, referral programs, career fairs, newspapers, lots of different ways to recruit people. And it's important to not just recruit a lot of people, but to recruit good people. Recruit applicants who have a good fit with the job openings and with the organization. So the main factors that attract applicants to a job are the characteristics of the job and of the organization, the behavior of the recruiter, and whether the applicant thinks they would fit in the organization. Again, the goals of recruitment are higher numbers of qualified job applicants and increased organizational diversity. So every organization wants to do that. They want to get big numbers of qualified people applying, and they want to make sure diversity is up. But different organizations may need to choose different recruitment methods to achieve these same goals. Same goals for everyone, but they might achieve them different ways. Now let's discuss validity. This is very important for selection procedures to be valid. There are 3 different types of validity as we discussed in chapter 2. Feel free to go back and watch this part of the chapter 2 video, but I'm going to review it now. Content validity is the degree to which a selection procedure samples all areas of the job. So content validity means it represents all of the content, all of the parts of it. Face validity is how well it seems to portray the job, and this is actually important too. but not as important as the content validity, making sure that your selection methods actually sample all the different areas of the job. For example, if you were hiring electricians, it would be very important for them to have good communication skills and good social skills, but you can't only look at that. You need to make sure that they have good skills as an electrician as well, and good skills as a worker, and many other skills. Let's move on to construct validity. So remember, content validity is making sure that your selection procedure samples all the areas of the job. Construct validity is making sure that your selection methods correlate with other similar selection methods and don't correlate with things that should be measuring something else. So construct validity is defined as an expected pattern of relationships with other measures, meaning that your predictor correlates with other predictors meant to measure the same thing and does not correlate with other predictors meant to measure other things. Finally, there's criterion-related validity, which is arguably probably the most important kind of validity, and this is the statistical relationship between the predictor and the outcome. It's showing that your selection procedure is related to job performance, that you use your selection procedure to choose people who will perform better on the job. This is measured by something called the validity coefficient. So the higher the validity coefficient, the more likely people who score high on your predictors are to do well at the job. So, as I just mentioned, criterion-related validity is very important. It shows that your selection methods are correlated with job performance. And organizations and IO psychologists are often doing criterion-related validity studies to prove numerically, statistically, that their selection procedures are correlated with job performance, that they're using good selection procedures that result in higher job performance, better employees. There's two ways to do this. One is with predictive validity. This is where you give your test to a group of applicants and correlate it with their later job performance, the ones who got the job. The second is concurrent validity. This is where you give the test to your current employees and compare it to their current job performance. The advantages to the predictive one, where you give the test to all of your applicants, is that you're actually validating the test on the population for which you plan to use it. You're planning to use these tests on big groups of applicants, so you test them on big groups of applicants. The other good thing about this is there's less range restriction. You get to do the test on groups of people who score high and low, versus the concurrent validity, where you're giving the test to your current employees who already work for you, have managed to get the job and keep the job. You have something called range restriction. You're only getting your top performers, because those lower people either didn't get the job or didn't keep the job. The advantages, though, to concurrent validity are that it's much cheaper and much faster, because you don't have to wait for the people to get the job after. You can do the test on one day and the job performance ratings the same day or the next day. Much faster and therefore much more common because of convenience. But if given the choice, it would be probably better to use the predictive validity, since that's the actual population you're planning to use it on and there's less range restriction. Another process that's important when you're doing criterion-related validity studies is cross-validation. So remember, criterion-related validity studies are proving that your selection methods are related to job performance. And cross-validation is basically doing this with two different groups of people to show that your results from the first group of people weren't by chance. They weren't having to do with the individual differences of that group. The way you conduct cross-validation is to first do the criterion-related validity study on sample number 1 and determine regression weights for each test. We'll talk about regression in a little bit. It's a statistical process that basically assigns a weight to each of the different predictors that are part of the selection process. So you do your criterion-related validity study on your first sample, you run all of your numbers. Step 2 is to replicate it. Do it again on a second sample. You're hoping for little shrinkage. Shrinkage is the change in explained variance. We're hoping that we can explain the variance in the people's job performance by their variance in their predictor scores. But of course, some variance is explained by individual differences. If this can stay the same between the two groups, then we get to step 3, where the regression weights from the first sample are able to predict the scores from the second sample. Then your study is cross-validated. This part's a little bit confusing, and if you're interested in more details on the math, I definitely suggest you read this part in the textbook, although you should be reading all the parts of the textbook. Please let me know if you have questions about cross-validation. I'd be happy to explain this in more detail. Let's move on to the right side of the screen, where we look at the difference between validity generalization and situational specificity hypothesis. These are opposites from each other. They're both very important. The validity generalization is the assumption that a test that is valid for one job will be valid for other similar jobs. So once we go through all this process of choosing our procedures and validating our procedures and everything, we might as well use that same selection method for a similar job. And science data has shown that this is true, that it's okay to use the same procedure, the same selection procedure for a similar job once it's been validated for a job. However, the courts don't necessarily agree. So we move on to the situational specificity hypothesis, which is the belief that even though a test has been shown to be valid for one job, we cannot assume it will be valid for another job, even if it's very similar. And while we found that this is not always the case, and we really can make a generalization from similar jobs, between similar jobs, the courts don't necessarily agree, and it's more defensible in court if you have your own selection procedure for every job. Let's move on to the legal issues, because that is related to legal issues anyway. First, let's talk about how hiring laws come to be. There's actually 4 different ways that a hiring law would exist. The first is an act passed by Congress. The second is case law, which are laws determined by previous court cases and their associated decisions. The third way would be an executive order, which came from a previous president. And the fourth way would be a state law. However, the U.S. government has developed something called the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures. And although these are not technically laws, they're treated like law. And they do provide a lot of guidance to employers about how to validate their selection tests and the things that they should follow to keep themselves out of trouble in court. These guidelines apply to organizations with 15 or more employees. Technically not laws, but they're treated as such. So we talked about acts passed by Congress, case law, which is based on previous cases, the Uniform Guidelines, which is written by the U.S. government, including the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. At the bottom of this next slide, you'll see executive orders, which are laws enacted by previous presidents. These only apply to federal contractors. And then many states have additional laws. Even some cities have additional laws to provide more protection for protected groups. At the top of this slide, we'll define protected group real quick, which is a subgroup of individuals protected under the law, such as women, ethnic minorities, and people over 40. A lot of people fall into a protected group, and several people are part of more than one protected group. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, is the government agency which is in charge of monitoring employers and making sure that they provide equal opportunity to all groups, specifically these protected groups. And they monitor things like selection procedures and pay. In this chapter, we're talking about selection procedures and making sure that they are not discriminating. So on the next page, we will talk about discrimination. The first type of discrimination in terms of hiring is called disparate treatment, and this is intentional discrimination. Disparate treatment is where the organization or the employer, the boss, the person who's hiring is discriminating on purpose. They would prefer to hire men, or they would prefer to hire younger people, or they won't hire people of color, or they do so not as often. This is when they're straight up discriminating. It's intentional. Obviously, it's a problem. It's called disparate treatment. We're going to discuss, however, in more detail, something called adverse impact, which is not intentional on the part of the employer. It's where the actual selection procedure itself favors one group over another. And at the bottom of this page, we'll do a little bit of math, although I do notice that I made a little error. Let me change that real quick. It'll be a lot easier to deal with. If you notice, I had it written as 80% instead of 8%. Let me change my decimals real quick so they'll make more sense. All right, I think we're good. Back to our... Perfect. All right. So adverse impact is where the selection procedure favors one group over another. And we can prove this using the 80% rule, or the 4/5 rule, which is a general rule established by the U.S. courts to show whether adverse impact is there or not. This rule states that the selection ratio for the protected group must be at least 80% of the selection ratio for the unprotected group. Let's look at the example in the green box. 100 people of color applied for the job and 1,000 white people applied for the job. Of those 100 people of color, 8 were hired. Of those 1,000 white people, 90 were hired. Now that I've fixed my decimals, you can see that that's an 8% hiring rate for people of color and a 9% hiring rate for white people. When you divide that out, it works out to 0.88, or 88%. That shows that the people of color are being hired at 88% of the rate of white people, which is considered okay because that's more than 80%. This is the 80% rule. However, over in the red box, we see this time only 7 of the 100 people of color were hired. The 90 people stayed the same on the bottom. And when we divide the 7% divided by 9%, it comes to 0.78. This is less than 0.8. This is less than 80%. So it shows adverse impact. It shows that the selection procedure does favor white people because white people are being hired at a rate of more than 80%, or the people of color are being hired at a rate of less than 80%. We give it a thumbs down because it does not meet the criteria and therefore it demonstrates adverse impact of this selection procedure. Again, please send me an email if you'd like more details on the math side of this. So when there is an adverse impact case, a situation where people feel that they are not being hired due to being in a protected group, or that the selection procedure is unfairly favoring a different group, this goes to court, and the first step is for the plaintiff to demonstrate the adverse impact using that 80% rule we just talked about. And if they can do that, if they can show that the selection procedure results in less than 80% rate of hiring for the protected group compared to the non-protected group, it counts as adverse impact, and we go to step 2, where the employer demonstrates that it is a valid test. This is why it's so important to test for validity and do all of that complicated stuff we talked about earlier, so that if you end up in court, you can show that your test is valid. When that happens, the third step is for the plaintiff to show that even though this test is valid, there are other equally valid selection procedures with lower adverse impact. And if those were available, if they could have used lower adverse impact with an equally valid selection procedure, then they may be found guilty. All right, let's move on to the probably most important or trickiest part of this chapter, which are all the issues with administrating the predictors and using the data from the predictors. Remember, predictors are all of the different methods of the different tests that you give to the applicants, such as a personality test, an integrity test, an interview, those sort of things. If we look at the Venn diagrams, you'll see the thumbs up has our 3 predictors spread out, covering a lot of different job performance criterion. There's also very little overlap between them. However, in our thumbs down Venn diagram, you can see there's a lot of overlap, and they're covering less of the job performance criterion. And the reason this is bad is that we want predictors that are highly correlated with the criterion of the job of job performance, showing that they're valid, but are not correlated with each other. So we want valid predictors that are not redundant. You'll see the two that are really overlapping in the thumbs down diagram are extroversion tests 1 and 2. We can all agree it's kind of pointless to give the whole group of applicants 2 different tests on extroversion if they're found to be highly correlated with each other in the first place. It's redundant. Once we've decided which predictors to use, it's important to weight them properly. So sometimes you could use the job analysis to weight your predictors. For example, if the job analysis shows that interpersonal skills are twice as important as mechanical ability, you'll give twice the weight to the personality test than the skills test, right? If it's twice as important to have those personality skills than it is to have the mechanical ability, we'll double the weight of the personality test and keep the ability test regular. A second way to do this is a lot more complicated. Again, feel free to contact me if you'd like to talk about the statistics behind all of this. And this is to use a regression equation. So this is done by administering the validity study and running the numbers using the statistics package. And the regression equation that results will determine how much of the outcome variance is predicted by each selection tool. So if you look at this complicated looking equation, you'll see Y is the outcome variance. Remember, outcome is job performance. So the difference between people in job performance scores can be accounted for by their difference in extroversion, integrity, and their interview skills. But as you can see, the integrity is more important. It gets a weight of 3, whereas the extroversion and the interview skills each get a weight of 2. That 1.5 at the end is a constant factor that just sort of works out with the math. But the important thing here is to look at the difference in weights. The extroversion and interview skills get a weight of 2 versus a weight of 3 for the integrity test. Once we've decided which predictors to use and how to weight them, we move on to predictor sequencing. What order do we administer them in? And there are 2 approaches to this. The first is called the multiple hurdle approach, where the applicant must pass one predictor before moving on to the next predictor. This is a cheaper way to do things because not everybody has to do every predictor. The pool gets smaller and smaller as you weed people out. And many organizations save the expensive or longer predictors for the end because there'll be fewer number of applicants taking them, and this will help them save money. A second method of predictor sequencing is called the multiple cutoff approach. So all the applicants do all the predictors, but they have to get a minimum score on all of them to move on. In the diagram, you'll see the woman got an F on one and an A on the other, so she may not get hired because she didn't meet her minimum score, likely on the F minus. So again, multiple hurdle approach means you have to pass one to get to the next. Multiple cutoff approach means you take them all, but you need to get a minimum score on every one to be considered for hiring. Something else to consider with predictors is cutoff scores. So again, we talked about on the last slide we talked about having to pass one test to get to the next. But what does it mean pass the test? Is it 50%, 60%? Is it a B or an A minus? What does it mean to pass? What should your minimum or your cutoff be? There's 2 ways of doing this. One is with a norm-based cutoff score, where you basically pick a certain percentage. Everybody takes the test, and the top 20% move on. The criterion referenced cutoff score is a straight-up number. Everybody takes the test, and if you score more than 7, you move on. So you can see why both of these are good options, and depending on your validity and your predictors, you may choose to either do the norm-based, where you choose the top percent, or the criterion referenced cutoff score, where you actually need to score a preset score. Up on the top right-hand corner, I have a little definition in there. A band is a range of predictor scores within which all scores are considered statistically equal. So a lot of these predictors, a lot of these tests have a wide range of scores. And if I score 100 and you score 102, that's considered the same score. So that's called a band. It's a range of scores that are considered to be the same. Let's talk for a moment about predictor accuracy. In the green box on the top left, we are going to talk about false negatives and false positives. This is a graph of test scores versus job performance. So remember, this criterion-related validity is important. How do applicants' test scores relate to their future job performance? And as predicted, the higher test scores result in higher job performance. But let's look for a minute at the quadrant that says false negative. The false negatives are somebody who scored low on their test, but performed high on the job. They may have been overlooked for the job because of their low scores when really they're very capable of performing. On the bottom right-hand quadrant, still looking at that green, the graph with the green square around it, are the false positives. False positives are people who scored high on their tests, high on their selection methods, but then they didn't do well on the job. It was a false positive. They looked good, but they weren't good. Moving on to the purple box, we see what happens when our selection methods have very, very high validity. See how it's less spread out? We're really able to predict more accurately. The higher their test score, the higher their job performance. As you can see, this results in very, very few false negatives and false positives because it's such a valid measure. There's very little error. There's not too many people who score high on the test but are not good at the job. And there's very few people who score low on the test and are good at the job because it's a very valid procedure. Moving on to the graph in the pink box, this one has very low validity. You'll see that red space is spread out even more. It really doesn't predict anything. People with low test scores don't do any better on the job than people with high test scores. This has very low validity and, as you can imagine, lots of false negatives and false positives. Looking down at the graphs on the bottom, the one in the orange box has a high cutoff score. So now we've moved back to moderate validity, right? We've moved back to that same oval shape from the first one where it's moderately valid. It's pretty good. Your predictors are pretty good at predicting job performance. But we've moved the cutoff score higher in order to get hired. As you can see, this increases the false negative quadrant, right? It's a higher score to get hired. You need to get an A or we're not going to hire you. You're going to have a lot of false negatives, people who got B pluses and really would have been great at the job. Moving on to the blue box, they've moved the cutoff score down very low. Now we have lots of false positives. Now you only need a D to get the job. So you have lots of people who are getting the job and really aren't capable of it. So moving that cutoff score can result in more false negatives or more false positives. And depending on what kind of job you have you're hiring for, you may choose to move that cutoff score accordingly. I like these graphs. They do a very good job of explaining the difference between the validity and the difference between the cutoff scores. So definitely take some time looking at and understanding these graphs on predictor accuracy. Let's quickly discuss predictor utility. A selection utility is the monetary value of a personnel selection procedure. So we've been discussing these procedures, right? We use several predictors to create a selection procedure. And utility is sort of the return on investment for using a particular selection procedure, right? Is it worth it? We have to consider the cost. We also consider the validity if it doesn't really work. If we go back to the graph with the very low validity in that pink box there, it doesn't work. Your test doesn't predict if they're going to be good at the job, so why waste your money? But if you have low cost and high validity, it might be worth it. The third thing to consider is the selection ratio, which is the number of job vacancies relative to the number of job applicants. If I have 2 openings and 3 applicants, it's probably not worth spending $1 million deciding which 2 of the 3 to hire. But hopefully, if I have 2 openings, I have 3,000 applicants, and it is worth putting the money into a good selection procedure because I'll end up with 2 very high quality employees from such a big pool. So again, selection utility, the utility is its value, its return on investment. We're comparing the cost of this procedure, the validity, how well it works, and the number of people that are applying versus the number of openings we have. Almost done. We're on the very last part, which is considering the applicant's experience during this process, or applicant reactions. It's been found that applicants generally react more positively to methods that are more related to the job itself, work samples and interviews. They're not as big of a fan of things like personality tests or integrity tests that seem more about them as a person than about their ability to do the job. These preferences may be because applicants like procedures that are obviously job related and give them an opportunity to show what they can do. This is pretty obvious, but applicants dislike when they're treated differently from other applicants. And not surprisingly, methods preferred by applicants are often more expensive, right? Work samples and interviews are a lot more expensive to administer than a personality test. All right, that is it. Let's do our Chapter 7 review, and then you'll be all done. Remember, recruitment is defined as increasing the number of job applicants, their quality and fit with the job openings and with the organization's culture, while also meeting legal and ethical obligations. So the goals of recruitment are higher numbers of qualified job applicants, as well as increased organizational diversity. Some factors that attract, or the main factors that attract applicants to a job, are the characteristics of the job and of the organization, the behavior of the recruiter, and whether the applicant thinks that they would fit in the organization. Validity of selection procedures is very important to make sure that these selection procedures work and they're worth your investment, and also to be able to defend them in court if need be. So there are several types of validity. There's content validity, the degree to which the selection procedure samples all areas of the job. Face validity, the degree to which it seems to portray the job. Construct validity shows that your predictors correlate with similar predictors and don't correlate with dissimilar predictors. Criterion-related validity, which is the correlation between the predictor and the outcome. So the correlation between the selection method and job performance. The validity coefficient is the number that measures this correlation, your criterion-related validity. Criterion-related validity studies are done to prove criterion-related validity, to show that your selection methods are related to job performance. These can either be predictive, where you use applicant data and compare to their job performance later on, or concurrent, where you give the predictors to your current employees. It's faster, but there's more range restriction since you're only getting people who have kept the job. Cross-validation is done by duplicating a criterion-related validity study on a second sample to be sure that each predictor still accounts for a similar amount of variance. Validity generalization is the assumption that the same test is valid for jobs with similar tasks and KSAOs. Situational specificity hypothesis is the opposite of validity generalization and says that every job needs its own selection procedure, and courts often require or prefer this. Laws are determined by congressional acts, case law, executive orders, and state or city law. Uniform guidelines are treated as laws and apply to organizations with 15 or more employees. However, many people consider these uniform guidelines fairly outdated, given that they were written more than 40 years ago. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC, is a government agency which monitors employers to ensure equal opportunity employment. Disparate treatment is intentional discrimination against a protected group. Adverse impact is not intentional, but it's when a selection method results in a disadvantage for a protected group. And we measure adverse impact using the 80% rule. The 80% rule says that a protected group has to have at least 80% of the hiring rate of the non-protected group. If they don't, we can prove adverse impact. Organizations should use predictors that are highly correlated with job performance criterion, but not highly correlated with each other. So we want to use predictors that sample different areas of the job but are not redundant. Predictors can be weighted according to job analysis or using a regression equation. The multiple hurdle approach has predictors sequenced so that applicants must pass one part to get to the next. Expensive predictors are often saved till last using this method. The multiple cutoff approach has applicants complete all selection methods, and they must obtain a minimum score on each one. These minimum scores can be determined by a norm-based cutoff score, where only the top scores are selected, a certain percentage, or a criterion referenced cutoff score, where the applicant must score higher than a predetermined number. A band is a range of scores that are considered equal, they're scores that are very close to each other, considered to be the same. Selection utility is the monetary value of a selection procedure, determined by cost, validity, and selection ratio. Remember, selection ratio is the number of applicants versus the number of job openings. And finally, applicant reactions are shown to be more favorable toward work-related predictors, like work samples and interviews, than worker-related ones. Applicants dislike being treated differently. All right, please send me an email if you have any questions on Chapter 7, and I will see you all soon for Chapter 8.